since I'm so heavily involved with the arts, obviously I was going to find some kind of research paper to do with that. I did mine over censorship within different areas in the arts. But before going into examples of censorship, it's probably a pretty good idea to figure out some of the reasons why people want things censored. And of course, there's always political stuff going on. People hold to their political beliefs very strongly. So there's always going to be political reasoning for people wanting things censored. So in the late 80s into the early 90s, there was a group of people that were actually pushing for Congress to pass legislation that would restrict any funding on art depicting obscene or indecent material and not giving them any funding, which it didn't pass, but this included any kind of sexual activity, but the main focus was homosexuality depicted in art because people are so against that, or at least were back then. Things have changed by now, but back then people were very against having any kind of homosexual stuff depicted. And then another example that was around the same time, the NEA, which is the National Endowment for the Arts, which does a lot of funding for people who want to do art projects. They had to change the qualifications in response to the American Family Association, who absolutely hated a lot of the homosexual artists or people who would support any kind of homosexuality. They hated any kind of art that came out of that. So the NEA changed their funding qualifications and made people sign sheets that would say, this doesn't include any kind of homosexual art, anything, well, any kind of sexual activity at all. And then another common reason is a religious issue, because obviously in America we believe in freedom of religion. Both of those examples from the previous slide can also be applied to this. So that group of people that wanted Congress to pass the legislation were also trying to ban any kind of art that would depict any kind of religion or their adherence in any negative way. And then the founder of the AFA, Donald Wildman, was actually a pastor, and another one of the things that he really wanted to combat was any kind of anti-Christian depictions in any kind of art. So with a couple reasons out of the way, very commonly music gets censored. So in Nazi Germany, they very strongly attempted to ban any kind of jazz music from being played within the country because of its strong ties to Black people and their culture, and then also because it really emphasized musical freedom and improv, and they wanted to try to remove any of that. But they figured, okay, if we end up banning it here, people are just going to go to radio stations from different countries and listen to it there. So they kind of gave up on that effort. And then Soviet Russia wanted to ban Tchaikovsky because he was a homosexual and they didn't really agree with that lifestyle, so they did their best to try to ban any of his music. But they figured they couldn't really ban that either, so instead they turned him into a Soviet hero of sorts, and then by doing that they were able to kind of filter through anything that he wrote or what anybody else wrote about him, and then they could kind of pick and choose what people would hear about him. So then theater censorship, way back in early America, this was a very common issue. Like towards the very beginning of America, many people were very anti-theater, and it wasn't until 1768 that a lot of people started to accept theater, but even then it wasn't like just a common thing. There were still many people that were against it. And of course, once the revolution began around that time, the government actually told people to stay away from theaters to promote frugality. But even though they were trying to keep people away, there were still quite a few shows that were put on. Obviously, there weren't as many as there could be, well, I mean, 2 years ago, but there were still quite a few that were being played. And then an example of one specific show that got censored is The Breaking Point, which was written by Edward Garnett. And this was denied a performance license because, at least in the words of the censor, because of some of the things that were hinted at in the show. Because while it was never explicitly stated, it hints at the possible pregnancy of an unmarried woman who had been having an affair with another married man. And the censor thought, okay, that's a little too far, and denied it a performance license. But when it was published, the author actually included a letter that he had written back in response to the censor, and basically told him, you're not censoring it because of the material, you're just censoring it because you don't think that as many people would find as much pleasure out of this as in other shows. And this show was actually a big stepping point towards getting rid of some of the censorship with theater. And this was actually the start of performance licenses being just completely removed. And at that point, any kind of venue that would hold a show just had to know, okay, if people don't like this, there's a possibility that we might get sued or anything like that. So it was more up to the venue on what would be played compared